out to the graves of the soldiers who had lost their lives during the Civil War and literally decorate their graves with flowers. And through the years, that decoration day is transformed to what we know now as Memorial Day, where we honor all of the men and women who gave their all and literally the last true measure of devotion to our country and to its flag. In regards to the Civil War reference, 5 of the 12 gentlemen I'll be speaking of tonight did in fact serve in the Civil War, so that's probably a good place to start. This is chronological, by the way. You'll probably figure that out as we go through. The governors of Michigan serve as the commanders-in-chief of the state's National Guard units, but 12 of Michigan's 47 governors also saw active service during our nation's 250-year history. This presentation shares their often incredible and courageous stories of service and great sacrifice to our state and to our nation. Moses Wisner, 12th governor, 1859 to 1861, Civil War, colonel of the 22nd Michigan Volunteer Infantry Regiment from August of 1862 to January of 1863. Moses Wisner was born in Springport, New York on June 3rd, 1815. In 1837, he moved to Michigan, purchased a farm, then eventually moved to Pontiac 2 years later, where he studied law in the office of his brother George and Rufus Hosmer. The name Hosmer might be familiar, especially to our friends from Lansing. Hosmer later served as the editor and publisher of the Lansing State Republican. In 1841, Wisner was admitted to the bar and served as the prosecuting attorney of Lapeer County. He attended the 1854 meeting under the oaks in Jackson, the formation of the National Republican Party, and in 1858 was that party's nominee for governor of the great state of Michigan, to which position he was elected handily. After serving only one 2-year term, and they did serve 2-year terms back then, as Michigan's 12th governor, he returned to Pontiac, and shortly after, in the spring and summer of 1862, raised a new regiment of infantry, the 22nd Michigan. It was commissioned as its colonel on August 8th, 1862. On Thursday, September 4th, 1862, the 22nd received, quote, a splendid stand of colors. You knew there had to be a flag reference, right? Wisner replied, quote, soldiers, do you see these stars and stripes that wave above my head? You have been requested never to let them be trailed in the dust or soiled by rebel hands. No, by yonder heaven I swear that traitor hands shall never soil the purity of that banner, end quote. The 22nd was raised largely in Oakland County, was sent to Kentucky upon its muster into federal service. It was said of Colonel Wisner that, quote, his treatment of his men was kind, though his discipline was rigid, unquote. Wisner was a fervent abolitionist, and while on the march in Kentucky, according to an account given by one of his subordinate officers, quote, the Negroes flocked to our standard and often impeded us by their sheer numbers. They ate up all our rations, but the colonel would not turn a man away. He would stand any inconvenience rather than send one back to bondage, end quote. Civil War encampments were breeding grounds of death, and the officers and men were subjected to the vagaries of stifling hot and frigid cold temperatures and exposed at almost every turn to the many diseases and unsanitary conditions they were exposed to. Often inadequate supplies and food. Their bodies had not had a chance to build up natural immunities to the diseases they were exposed to in the South. One 22nd volunteer was First Lieutenant Gus Smith, a 32-year-old farmer from Howell. He wrote regularly to his parents. In his first letter from Kentucky, written on September 22nd, reveals the realities of the war he had just entered. Quote, here we are in the darndest dirty hole in the world. It is very dry and dusty here. We have to lay on the ground in the open air. We are bothered almost to death for water to drink. Say nothing of washing ourselves and our clothes. Haven't changed my shirt since I left Pontiac and don't know when I can, as our baggage is 15 miles from here. We are the dirtiest set you ever saw. We have to drink water out of a common duck pond. It looks green when we dip it up. If we don't all get sick, it will be a wonder, end quote. You see where this is going. In the early winter of 1862, Colonel Wisner was afflicted with typhoid fever, no doubt contracted from the contaminated water and food. On January 5th, 1863, in a private home in Lexington, Kentucky, and even before his regiment saw action with the enemy, the former governor of Michigan and colonel of the 22nd Michigan Infantry Regiment succumbed to his illness at the age of 47 years of age, leaving his wife, Angelina, and 4 children to mourn his loss. Quote, with muffled drums and reversed arms, his men followed the body to the cars that were to take it to our mother, Michigan. I love that quote, our mother, Michigan. His body was returned to Pontiac, and he now rests in Oak Hill Cemetery, where, quote, he sleeps the sleep of the martyr for his country, and he has become a part of her hallowed dust. David Howell Jerome, 18th governor of Michigan, 1881, 1883, organizing colonel of the 23rd Michigan Infantry Regiment, the summer of 1862. David Howell Jerome was born the youngest of 9 children in Detroit on November 17, 1829. He was the first Michigan governor actually born in the state. His parents moved from New York to Michigan in the pre-statehood days in 1828. Shortly after Jerome's birth, sadly, his father died, and his mother moved the majority of their family back to New York, leaving some of Jerome's adult siblings here in Michigan. In 1834, Jerome returned with his family to St. Clair County, Michigan, where they farmed. In 1855, he and a brother moved to Saginaw, where he served as an alderman. In 1859, he married Lucy Peck, and they would have 3 children, only one of whom would survive to adulthood. In the midst of the Civil War, the summer of 1862 brought ever-increasing casualties. And with the war going badly for the Union, President Lincoln issued a call for 300,000 additional troops. To meet Michigan's quota of 11,686 men, the call was divided among the state's 6 congressional districts, with each district supplying 1 infantry regiment, with an additional regiment, the 24th Michigan, forming in Wayne County. 17 infantry regiments were already in the field, so the newly formed regiments were numbered 18 to 24. Under these conditions, the 23rd Michigan Volunteer Infantry Regiment formed. Jerome was appointed by Governor Austin Blair as the organizing colonel of the 23rd and as the commandant of the East Saginaw training camp. Although he was the great-grandson of Samuel Jerome, who saw service in the Revolution, that's our one tie into the semi-quincentennial, the 250th birthday of our nation. As far as can be determined, Jerome had no military experience. He was, though, a strong advocate for the Republican Party. This often played into Governor Blair's decisions on whom would receive and be granted officers' commissions in leading Michigan regiments. Jerome was proficient in the recruiting, training, and organization of the regiment, and they left for the field at full strength in late September of 1862. Jerome, however, would not see service with the regiment, having been elected to the 27th District of the Michigan State Senate. He would serve in the Senate until 1868, being elected and representing 2 different districts, the 27th and the 26th. He also combined his service in the Senate with his role as military aide to Governor Henry Crapo, 1865, 1866. He was president of the State Military Board from 1865 to 1867, and served on the U.S. Board of Indian Commissioners from 1876 to 1881. Long and illustrious career in serving the military. He was elected as the 18th governor of Michigan in 1880 and served one 2-year term and was then defeated by fusionist candidate Josiah Bagol. He died at the age of 66 in New York on April 23rd, 1896, and is buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Saginaw, Michigan, section 32, lot 18. This is a really interesting side note. We speak of rabbit holes as historians and researchers, and this was a serious rabbit hole I dived down in researching Jerome. An interesting note, I think that Jerome may be the only Michigan governor to have had a piece of music composed and performed for him by John Philip Sousa and the Marine Corps Band. We were talking about Marines earlier. The piece, The Wolverine March, was composed by Sousa, the American March King, and performed by the band at a reception held at the Washington, D.C. Masonic Temple, hosted by the Michigan State Association on March 2nd, 1881. Sousa had just been appointed as the 17th director of the Marine Corps Band, and this reception would have been among the first with him as its conductor. The reception was held for Michigan dignitaries visiting DC for the March 4th, 1881 inauguration of President James Garfield. And you get to listen to a little bit of it.
You might be muted.
I won't play the whole thing, I promise, but it's got a.
I think you're muted.
Oh, did I mute it?
All right, try
Let's try that. Isn't that fun? Sounds very much like John Philip Sousa, doesn't it? We good? You can go online and listen to the rest of it if you care to. Let's see. Maybe not. There we go. Let's see. That will get us back here eventually.
Hit your next arrow.
Darn it. See, I told you about, let's see, here we go. There we go. And we're back. And mute, thank you. Russell, thank you. A hand for Jacob.
Yeah.
I would be even more nervous if Jacob wasn't here to help out with the tech stuff. Russell Alexander Alger, 20th governor, 1885, 1887. Captain, 2nd Michigan Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel, 6th Michigan Cavalry, Colonel, 5th Michigan Cavalry, Brevet Brigadier and Major General, Secretary of War, March 5th, 1897 to August 1st, 1899. Russell Alexander Alger was born February 27th, 1836 in Medina County, Ohio. His estranged parents died when he was a boy, and Russell was raised by an uncle on his farm while also supporting his 2 siblings. In 1860, after teaching and studying law, he moved to Grand Rapids and worked in the lumber business. 1861, he married his wife, Annette Henry, and they would have 6 children. He enlisted with the 2nd Michigan Cavalry as a captain in Company C on September 7th, 1861 at Grand Rapids at the age of 25. Was commissioned major on April 2nd, 1862. It was said that Alger was, quote, tall, erect, handsome, scrupulous about his attire, and his body language was that of a man used to command with no need to swagger, an expert horseman and tactician, and that Alger had few equals and no superiors as a commander, end quote. It was also, however, said of him that, quote, he tended to be impulsive and impetuous. A commander would later state, however, that Alger could be forgiven for his, quote, impulses of pardonable zeal, end quote. That commander, fellow Michigander, General George Armstrong Custer, who also had his own impulses of pardonable zeal. In April of 1862, while leading a charge, Alger was thrown from his horse, his side crushed and 5 ribs broken. On July 1st, 1862, at Boonville, Mississippi, with 100 men under his command, he led an attack against the Confederate force that was estimated to be 3,000 soldiers and routed them. Although he was wounded and taken prisoner, he escaped that very same day. He was commissioned as lieutenant colonel of the 6th Michigan Cavalry and for a time contemplated accepting a commission as a colonel with the United States Colored Troops. He was then commissioned a colonel of the 5th Michigan Cavalry on February 28, 1863, a regiment that would be attached to the famed Michigan Cavalry Brigade under the command of General George Armstrong Custer. At Gettysburg in the East Cavalry Field on the 3rd day of the fight, July 3rd, 1863, he personally led no less than 4 charges. In pursuit of the Army of Northern Virginia at the Battle of Boonesboro, Maryland, July 8, 1863, Colonel Alger was wounded again, this time by a Confederate minie ball to the left thigh. After recuperating, he returned to the regiment in September and commanded a brigade of cavalry from January to August of 1864. In September 1864, Alger resigned and was honorably discharged under a bit of a cloud, citing, quote, the health of my family as his reason. A previous month, he had dropped out of formation near Harper's Ferry without approval, that pardonable zeal again. He was eventually granted sick leave, but was denied an extension of the leave and still chose to leave the brigade without proper approval. General Phil Sheridan considered bringing him up on charges of being AWOL, away without leave, but instead his resignation was accepted and the charges were dropped. By this time, Alger had fought in more than 60 battles. I personally think he was just worn out. He would eventually receive brevet promotions as a brigadier and a major general for gallant service throughout the war and meritorious services at the Battle of Trevilian Station, Virginia. The cloud that he left under, though, would continue to darken his path, both in his run for governor of Michigan and later on in his appointment as Secretary of War. He was the first commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was an organization post-war formed of Union veterans of the Civil War, serving in 1867 as the first commander of the GAR in Michigan. And in 1889, he served as the national commander of the GAR and was also a member of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, a Civil War officers' fraternal organization. You'll notice on his capital portrait, he wears very proudly a lapel pin, and that is a Mullis pin, Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, which is a mouthful to say 6 times fast. Post-war, Alger moved to Detroit and excelled in almost every business venture he touched, including timber, shipping, light rail, banking, oil, mining, and livestock. He was elected 20th governor of Michigan in 1884 and served 1 2-year term, during which time he established the Michigan Soldiers' Home in Grand Rapids, which was basically set up for Civil War veterans. He opted to not seek re-election in 1886. At the 1888 National Republican Convention, Alger's name was placed in nomination for President of the United States, eventually rising to 142 votes. Benjamin Harrison ultimately obtained the nomination. 1897, he was appointed by President William McKinley as Secretary of War, a post he held until 1899. During the Spanish-American War, he received criticism for supply and command issues that plagued the U.S. forces, and he resigned his post at the request of President McKinley. In 1902, Alger was appointed by fellow Civil War veteran and governor of Michigan, Aaron Bliss, to become Michigan's United States Senator, filling the seat of deceased Senator James McMillan. He was elected to the U.S. Senate the next year by the Michigan legislature and died in office on January 24, 1907. He is buried at Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit. While serving as Secretary of War, he was filmed inspecting the troops. This is very rare, I think, film footage, and as far as I know, the only footage we have of a governor who served in this time period. This is a quick one. It's kind of fun to see him in action as Secretary of the War. The gentleman to the left is General Wheeler, who was actually a Confederate general during the Civil War and by the Spanish-American War was leading our troops. Those horses came dangerously close, don't you think? Both to the cameraman and to the entourage there. Alger's walking right to the camera. Anyway, I thought that was kind of fun. Let me flip back here. Hazen Pingree, Hazen Stewart Pingree, 24th governor, 1897-1901, Civil War, 14th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery, 1861 to 1865. So you thought it was going to be all men who served in Michigan infantry regiments. Hazen Stewart Pingree was born August 30th, 1840 in Denmark, Maine, the son of a farmer, and at age 14 moved to work in a cotton mill in Saco, Maine, and eventually as a shoemaker in Hopkinton, Massachusetts. In 1861, at the age of 20, he and 46 other young men from his hometown enlisted with the 14th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, Company F, the Scott Guards, as they were known. The regiment served largely on guard duty in Washington, D.C. The following January, the 14th was redesignated as the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery Regiment. The companies of the regiment served in the forts in and around Washington, and in August, they first, quote, smelt powder at the Second Battle of Bull Run. They then returned to the forts of D.C. and served there, with some detachments being sent to other forts until May of 1864. At that time, many of the heavy artillery regiments, the men sort of derisively referred to these men as the heavies, were sent into the field as infantry as a part of General Ulysses S. Grant's Overland Campaign. Most of the boys that were fighting in the field saw the regiments that were manning the heavy guns in the forts around DC as having sort of light duty. When Grant started his Overland Campaign, he was in desperate need of troops, so he basically reconverted most of the heavy artillery regiments that were in the forts in DC and sent them into the field as a part of that campaign. On May 19th, 1864, as a part of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, the 1st was engaged heavily at the Harris Farm and suffered 398 casualties within an hour of heavy combat. 6 days later, the regiment was engaged at the Battle of North Anna, Virginia, and while escorting a wagon train to Port Royal, Virginia, Pingree was captured by the Confederate raider John Singleton Mosby. At the 1891 Detroit National Grand Army of the Republic encampment, Pingree told the story of his capture, and according to him, quote, while camped for the night, the train was surrounded by Mosby's men and the outfit captured. While on the march towards Andersonville Prison, Pingree attracted the attention of Mosby, which is definitely something you don't want to do. During one of the halts, Mosby ordered Pingree to disrobe himself of his fine dress coat and, quote, hand it over. Pingree objected, and after some parleying, Mosby told him he could keep the dang coat. He said he was afraid he might be mistaken for a Yank if he wore it. Mosby then demanded Pingree's rubber poncho blanket. Pingree begged to keep it, but Mosby demanded it and then told him to go over to one of his orderlies and tell the orderly he had told him to give him one of his own blankets in exchange. Many years later, Pingree called upon Mosby when he was serving in the Grant administration and asked him if he remembered the exchange, and Mosby did. Pingree spent the next 6 months as, quote, a guest of the Confederacy in numerous prisons, including Gordonsville and Lynchburg, Virginia, Salisbury, North Carolina, and the infamous camp at Andersonville, Georgia, and eventually Millen, Georgia, where he was able to orchestrate his exchange by assuming the name of a sick soldier. I've often wondered what happened to that sick soldier, and I feel a little bad about it. He rejoined his regiment in the trenches of Petersburg and witnessed Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse and mustered out with his regiment on August 15, 1865. According to several accounts, while a prisoner, Pingree befriended several Michigan soldiers, and a number of them told them basically what a great place Michigan was, and especially the city of Detroit. Pingree took the soldiers' advice, moved to Detroit, where he worked in the boot factory owned by Henry Baldwin, who would become another Michigan governor. He then started his own very lucrative shoe manufacturing company, Pingree and Smith. The current Detroit company, Pingree Detroit, is named after him. The company, which is worker-owned cooperative producing sustainable products, honors the legacy of Pingree, hiring many veterans. In 1872, Pingree married Frances Gilbert, and they would have 3 children. He was elected the 43rd mayor of Detroit in 1889. The Grand Army of the Republic, of which Pingree was a proud member, the Detroit Post number 384, held its 1891 national encampment in Detroit. This was a big deal to host the national encampment of the Grand Army of the Republic, and Michigan served as the host state a number of times. Mayor Pingree and his wife Frances opened up their home in Detroit to 75 attending members of his regiment, and they encamped in his yard. Pingree would serve as mayor until his election as the 24th governor of Michigan in 1896. In both positions, he was well known for his strong support of very progressive initiatives aimed at assisting those in need and reining in the power of big business and monopolies. He also received, when he was mayor of Detroit, the nickname Potato Patch Pingree, because he let many of the poor people of the city use the vacant ground to plant gardens and potatoes so they could feed themselves. Again, very, very progressive for him. He would serve 2 terms as governor, and on his return from an African hunting trip with his son, after he'd served as governor, was stricken with peritonitis and died in London on June 18, 1901. His body was returned to his homeland, and he's buried in Detroit's Woodlawn Cemetery. Aaron Thomas Bliss, 25th governor, 1901-1905, brevet major of the 10th New York Cavalry Regiment, 1861 to 1864. Aaron Thomas Bliss was born May 22nd, 1837 in Madison County, New York. As a youngster, he worked on the family farm and then in the mercantile business, eventually becoming a partner. With the outbreak of the Civil War, he enlisted in 1861 with the Peterman Guard, which would form the core of Company D of the 10th New York Cavalry Regiment. He was elected sergeant. The 10th saw service in August of 1862, a second Bull Run, and Bliss was promoted to captain November 22nd, 1862. He saw continuous service with his regiment until being taken prisoner during the Petersburg campaign at the Battle of Reed Station, Virginia, June 29, 1864. He was sent to Andersonville Prison in Georgia and then to Macon, Georgia, and was able to escape from prison November 29, 1864. After 3 weeks of eluding his captors, he finally reached the Federal lines on December 17th and rejoined his regiment outside Petersburg. He was mustered out of the service with the brevet rank of major on February 18th, 1865. In 1865, he too moved to Michigan, to Saginaw, and worked in logging camps, became a partner in a sawmill, and also expanded into salt mines, banking, and the mercantile business. In 1868, he married Elisabeth Phelps. He was elected to the Michigan Senate in 1882. In 1885, Governor Alger appointed Bliss as his aide-de-camp on the staff with the rank of colonel. In 1888, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In 1900, he ran as the Republican candidate for governor and was elected to the post as our 25th governor, following fellow Civil War veteran Hazen Pingree. He was reelected in 1902 to a second two-year term. That same year, while serving as governor of Michigan, Bliss appointed his old boss and fellow Civil War veteran Russell Alger to the U.S. Senate. These names keep popping up in circles with these men that worked together and fought together. Under his leadership as governor, the Brown Books, should have clicked onto this, sorry about that. The Brown Books, which documented the service records of all 90,000 Michigan Civil War soldiers, were compiled and published. The Brown Books are our Bible. Anyone that researches Michigan Civil War history is very dependent on all the wonderful information that was compiled in the Brown Books. So I'm eternally grateful for Bliss directing that project while he was governor. Bliss served as the Michigan Department Commander of the Grand Army of the Republic in 1897. You see a pattern here, and was also a member of MULUS, the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States. You'll also see on Pingree's official capital, or Bliss's official capital portrait, the MULUS pin on his lapel. All of these portraits that we have in the building, every single item in each portrait is there for a very specific reason. And those two gentlemen very proudly made sure that their official portraits included their MULUS pins on their lapels. That kind of is an example of the great pride they took in being Civil War veterans and Civil War officers of the Union Army and proud members of MULUS. When he died on September 16, 1906, just short of 2 years after leaving office, his obituary stated, quote, "The heroes of the Civil War were the men he ever delighted to honor. The veterans of the rank and file of the Civil War were the men he was most ambitious to serve," end quote. An example of which, when he served in Congress, he facilitated the pension requests of over 1,000 individual applicants. He's buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Saginaw. Fred Warren Green, 31st governor, 1927 to 1931, Spanish-American War veteran, captain of Company G of the 31st Michigan Volunteer Infantry Regiment, May 1898 to May 1899. Fred Warren Green was born October 20th, 1872 in Manistee, Michigan. All our northern Michigan friends here. He earned a teaching certificate at the Michigan Normal School, Eastern Michigan University in 1893. Worked as a reporter, and I never knew this about him, coached the normal school football team for one season. He put himself through law school at the University of Michigan by selling insurance. At the outset of the Spanish-American War, he enlisted as a first lieutenant in Company G of the 31st Michigan Infantry Regiment. The 31st Michigan Infantry mustered into service on May 11, 1898, at Island Lake Training Camp near Brighton, Michigan. On May 15th, they were shipped to Chickamauga Park, Georgia, for additional training, embarking to the cars at midnight after a tearful farewell to their friends and family. At Chickamauga, there was an epidemic of typhoid. So on August 21st, the regiment was transported and marched to the new training ground outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. From Knoxville, they were shipped to Savannah, Georgia. On January 25th, the regiment embarked on ships for Cuba, arriving there on the 31st. Arriving there on the 31st was a pretty good time to arrive. In Cuba, the war was over. The regiment was engaged in occupation duty about midpoint on the island of Santa Clara Province near Placitas. The 31st returned to the United States on April 25th, 1899. It was disbanded at Savannah, Georgia on May 17, 1899. While in service, 20 men died from sickness in southern camps and hospitals, but none from enemy fire. While serving with the 31st Michigan Volunteer Infantry, Greene rose to the rank of first lieutenant and battalion adjutant. At the end of the war, he continued his military service in the Michigan National Guard for 14 years, rising to inspector general with the rank of brigadier general. He was national commander of the Spanish-American War veterans from 1929 until 1930. After the war, Fred Greene practiced law in Ypsilanti, married Helen Kelly of Cadillac, and they had one daughter. He started a furniture company, and in 1903, the Ypsilanti Reed Furniture Company was moved to Ionia, Michigan. Greene in 1912 was elected mayor of Ionia and went on to be reelected 13 times. Greene was an activist in the Michigan Republican Party, including serving as its state treasurer for 10 years. This despite his early support of former President Theodore Roosevelt and his progressive Bull Moose Party. In 1926, he won the party nomination for governor and was elected as the 31st governor of Michigan. He was reelected in 1928 and chose not to seek a third term in 1930. He died in Munising, November 30th, 1936, during the deer season of a heart failure, a condition brought on by overexertion after having shot a prize buck. Having had to drag out a number of deer in my life, I can fully attest to the strain on one's heart. He is entombed in a mausoleum, Highland Park Cemetery in Ionia, Michigan. Wilbur Marion Brucker, 32nd governor, 1931, 1933, Michigan National Guard, Pancho Villa campaign in the Mexican border, 42nd Rainbow Division, 166th Infantry, World War I, August of 1917 to April of 1919, Secretary of the Army, July 21st, 1955 to January 19, 1961. Wilbur Marion Brucker was born June 23rd, 1894 in Saginaw. You see a pattern there too, a lot of Saginaw governors who served. The son of a U.S. Congressman, Ferdinand Brucker. He attended the University of Michigan, and after receiving his law degree in 1916, served in the Michigan National Guard in the 33rd Infantry from 1916 to 1917 in the campaign against Pancho Villa. The Guard units were used mostly in supporting roles in the Pancho Villa campaign, so they didn't really cross into Mexico as the federal units, some of the federal units did. He then attended officers training camp and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. He served in France during World War I with the 166th Infantry Regiment of the famed 42nd Rainbow Division. The Rainbow Division derived its name from the fact that the members came from 26 different states that stretched out like a rainbow. As one of the first U.S. combat divisions in France, they saw 174 days of frontline combat and suffered over 14,000 casualties, with 166 suffering over 2,000 casualties in a 9-month period. Brucker was twice cited for bravery and received the Silver Star for bravery. Some sources indicating him being wounded and also receiving the Purple Heart. As commander of a unit charged with running telephone lines between the other units, Lieutenant Brucker and the men under his command were often in full sight of the enemy, stringing lines and repairing damaged ones. According to his colonel, Benson Hugh, Brucker's reconnaissance was, quote, invaluable. The fighting along the York River in late July 1918 was a critical, brutal phase of the Allied counteroffensive during the Second Battle of the Marne. U.S. forces, notably the 42nd Rainbow Division, engaged German troops in intense close quarters combat, including the heavily contested village of Sergei, which changed hands multiple times. In an account by Colonel Benson Hugh of the 166th Infantry, quote, I made several reconnaissance during that period. The first one, which I shall remember as long as I live, was made during the first or second day of the fight, when accompanied by Brucker, I went out on the terrain to the left and struck that territory at a time when the Germans had opened up with their large caliber shells with delayed fuse. Brucker and I dodged these shells for a long period of time. In fact, during all the time the shelling took place, by jumping consecutively from one shell hole to another as fast as the hole was made. Under these conditions, the 166th and Brucker continued to fight until the signing of the armistice in November of 1918, and were then engaged in occupation duty in Germany until April of 1919. After the war, Brucker remained in the Officer Reserves Corps until 1937. He served as president of the Rainbow Division Veterans and hosted the 1934 reunion, the national reunion of the Rainbow Division in Detroit, which was held at the Book Cadillac Hotel. Over 300 Rainbow Division veterans from 30 states attended the three-day event. He also served on the committee that published the official history of the 42nd Rainbow Division, and as the chairman of the history division of the 42nd. I have a soft spot in my heart for historians. So, post-war, Brucker practiced law in Saginaw and served as a prosecuting attorney. 1923, he married his wife Clara, and they would have one son. Fellow veteran Fred Green named him Michigan's Assistant Attorney General in 1927. He was then appointed Michigan Attorney General and was later elected to the position in his own right. From the post of Attorney General, he ran for governor in 1930 as a Republican and was elected as Michigan's 32nd governor, losing his 1932 reelection bid in a Democratic landslide led by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Brucker returned to private law practice and in 1955 was appointed by President Dwight Eisenhower as general counsel to the Defense Department and was then appointed as the Secretary of the Army and served in that role from 1955 to 1961. He died in Detroit on October 28, 1968, and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 15, Site 28B. Upon his death, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General William C. Westmoreland, stated, quote, "The United States Army mourns one of its greatest leaders." Frank Murphy, 35th governor, 1937 to 1939, World War I, first lieutenant captain of the 340th Regiment of the 85th Division in France, 1917 to 1919. Francis Frank William Murphy was born in Harbor Beach, Michigan on April 13, 1890. He attended public schools and received his law degree from the University of Michigan in 1914. When the United States entered World War I, he enlisted as a first lieutenant in Company B of the 340th Infantry Regiment, attached to the 85th Division, known as the Custer Division, due to their formation and training at Camp Custer in Battle Creek, Michigan. On July 23, 1918, he shipped out of Brooklyn, New York, for service in France on the steamer Vestris. The 85th Division was used to receive, equip, and train in forward casualty replacements and personnel returned from hospitals to frontline combat units. Men who passed through this division served largely in other divisions in the Meuse-Argonne offensive on the Western Front. After serving to the armistice on November 11, 1918, Murphy spent 8 months in occupation duty in Germany and shipped home with the rank of captain. Post-war, Murphy served in a number of roles in private practice and public positions, including as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan the Detroit Recorder's Judge, and Mayor of Detroit. In 1933, he was appointed by President Roosevelt as the Governor General of the Philippines and later as High Commissioner of the Philippine Commonwealth. I was giving a tour of the capital to a group of Philippine visitors probably 25 years ago. And we were in the rotunda and I pointed out the portrait of Murphy and was explaining. And some of the elderly people on the tour knew him and knew of his service in the Philippine Islands after all of these years. And spoke very, very fondly of his service in the Philippines. His progressive work in Detroit, battling the effects of the Depression and in fighting large corporations, endeared him to Detroiters. That, and along with the backing of Roosevelt, helped set the stage for his election as the 35th governor of Michigan in 1936. 1938, he lost the governor's race to former Governor Frank Fitzgerald and was then appointed as the U.S. Attorney General by FDR. And in 1940, as an Associate Justice to the United States Supreme Court. This is a big deal. 2 Michiganders have served on the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm looking at Jacob for affirmation, or anyone else. Anyone else know? I think it was maybe 2 Michiganders that have served as justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. It's a big deal. He died in Detroit while on a court recess of a coronary occlusion at the age of 59. I'm 59. I read that, my heart sank. I'm like, oh, 59, that's so young. July 19, 1949. He's buried in Rock Falls Cemetery in the Murphy family plot in Harbor Beach, Michigan. Henry Francis Kelly, 39th governor, 1943 to 1947, 2nd Lieutenant Infantry, 2nd Division, 1917 to 1918. Harry Francis Kelly was born April 19, 1895 in Ottawa, Illinois, the son of a lawyer. Kelly received his law degree from Notre Dame in 1917. He was in the Notre Dame Officer Reserve Corps, and with his graduating class, his entire class, he enlisted upon American entry into World War I. He entered the service on November 27, 1917, training at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant with the 9th Infantry of the 2nd Division, the Indian Head Division, as they were known. He shipped out on January 8, 1918 on the SS, I have no way of knowing how to pronounce this, Aurinia, I think, on its last trip to Europe. After disembarking its cargo of its U.S. troops in Liverpool on its return trip to the U.S., the troop carrier on February 4, 1918 was torpedoed by a German U-boat 67. The 9th Regiment entered the trenches of France March 21st, 1918 at Chateau Thierry. That spring, while leading an attack on a German machine gun nest, Kelly was wounded in both legs by a German hand grenade and was captured by 5 German soldiers. He escaped, only to be hit again in his leg by another grenade. That resulted in the amputation of the leg. He was awarded the French Cross of War, the Croix de Guerre, which you see here on the slide, with palm, and also received the Purple Heart. Throughout his life, Kelly downplayed his service, even to the point of multiple sources not really knowing which leg was lost. Some sources support that it was his left leg, while others, including his son-in-law, Thomas James, at the Supreme Court unveiling of the Kelly portrait in 1984, claim that it was in fact his right leg that was amputated. While running for governor, the Michigan press bemoaned the fact that he would not talk about his service or his wounding. They said, you won't get the story from Secretary of State Kelly. His press agents are muzzled. The prideful mementos are sequestered in a vault. He asks for support solely on his record as a departmental administrator without a tinge of hero worship. This is true of so many of these men. They really downplayed their service to our country. He was shipped to Walter Reed after his wounding, shipped to Walter Reed Medical Center where he received rehabilitation and returned home to Ottawa on September 16, 1918. And on December 5th, 1918, he was discharged. He was elected state's attorney in LaSalle County, Illinois, and in 1924, he moved to Michigan. He married Anne O'Brien in Detroit in 1929. They would have 6 children, one of them being Brian Kelly. We all know who Brian Kelly is, right? Played the dad on the TV show Flipper. Yeah, they call him Flipper, Flipper. You all know the song. Come on. See, I can use that with some of you folks. I have to be polite about this. Folks that are about my age and actually remember that TV show, which ran from 1964 to 1967 to age some of you. 1930, Kelly Sr. served as special prosecutor, as a supervisor of the State Liquor Control Commission, and as Michigan Secretary of State. From this position, he was elected governor of Michigan in 1942, being reelected in 1944. Michigan Veterans Trust Fund was created on February 25th, 1946, as a result of the work of Governor Harry Kelly. Through the signing of the Public Act 9 of 1946, it was established with $50 million in post-World War II reserve funds. It was designed to provide temporary assistance for emergency needs to Michigan's wartime veterans and their families. He was a member of the VFW and Disabled American Veterans. In 1946, he returned to private law practice, and in 1953 was elected as a justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, serving for 17 years, departing the court after reaching the mandatory retirement age. Only 6 weeks after retiring from the Michigan Supreme Court, he died February 8, 1971, of a massive stroke at the age of 75 in West Palm Beach, Florida. He's buried in Southfield at the Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. G. Mennen Williams, 41st governor, 1949 to 1960, World War II, U.S. Navy Air Combat Intelligence and legal officer, 1942 to 1946. G. Gerhard Mennen Williams was born February 23rd, 1911 in Detroit. His lifetime nickname, Soapy, was derived from his mother, who was heir to the Mennen Shaving Lotion Company. His 2 brothers, true story, nicknamed Lather and Suds. Lather, true story, Lather, Suds, and Soapy. You read it in his biography. He went to school first in Michigan, then to the prestigious Salisbury School in Connecticut. From there, he attended Princeton and the University of Michigan, where he received his law degree in 1936. Following year, he married Nancy Quirk of Ypsilanti, and they would have 3 children. He was a protege of family lawyer and friend, future Governor Frank Murphy. He worked in numerous positions as attorney for the Social Security Board in DC and the Department of Justice. On August 16, 1942, keep forgetting to forward that, he enlisted in the United States Navy, and in the fall attended Air Volunteer Service School and the Air Combat Intelligence School. He served 23 months aboard ship in the South Pacific on the aircraft carriers Bunker Hill, Essex, Hornet, and Yorktown, earning 10 battle stars. He was in operations at Wake Island, Marcus, the Marianas, and the Philippines. At the end of the war, he served in Japan with the United States Strategic Bombing Survey for combat intelligence. He returned to Michigan as the lieutenant commander in 1946 with the Legion of Merit and a presidential citation with 3 stars. He was discharged March 9, 1946. Post-war, Mennen Williams worked in Detroit for the Office of Price Administration. It was appointed by Governor Kim Ziegler to the Michigan Liquor Control Commission. He was elected as governor in 1948. He would go on to serve 6 2-year terms. In the Kennedy administration, he served as the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And in the 1968, 1969, he served as U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, much like his mentor, Frank Murphy, had. Upon his return, he was elected to the Michigan Supreme Court, serving two 8-year terms from 1971 to 1986, the last three as Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court until his mandatory retirement in 1986. He died on February 2nd, 1988, of a massive cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 76, and is buried in the Protestant cemetery on Mackinac Island. I think I've learned something from researching these folks. I'm never going to retire because so many of them sadly die within just a couple of years or even within months of their retirements. To think to work that hard your whole life and then not be able to enjoy your retirement—it's kind of sad. John Goode Burley Swainson, 42nd governor, 1961 to 1962, World War II, 378th Infantry Regiment, 95th Infantry Division, 1943 to 1945. We only have two more to go if you're keeping count. It was 12 total, and we're on number 11 now. So John Goode Burley Swainson, the Goode and Burley were family names, was born July 31st, 1925 in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. A lot of people don't realize we've had a number of foreign-born governors of Michigan, including Governor Swainson. His father was a salesman for the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, and when John was 12, his family relocated to Detroit and eventually their permanent home in Port Huron, Michigan. In the summer of 1943, John graduated high school. His hope was to apply to flight training in the U.S. Army Air Forces, but he was disappointed when he learned that only officers could fly and only American citizens could become officers. He also learned that if he volunteered for the Army after completing his training, he would automatically qualify for U.S. citizenship. After enlisting, he trained at Fort Custer and Battle Creek and then was shipped to Fort Benning, Georgia. He became a citizen and applied for and was accepted to officers training school. After the D-Day invasion, much like Grant with the Overland Campaign, the men in his officers' school were desperately needed, not as officers, but as infantry, and his entire class was sent for infantry maneuver training. John Swainson landed on the Normandy beaches as a private in Company C of the 378th Infantry Regiment, 95th Infantry Division, on September 15, 1944, which was also not a bad time to land on the Normandy beaches. He was part of a 5-man machine gun unit. The evening of November 15th, 1944, found C Company in the village of Thionville, France, on the outskirts of Metz. Swainson went out to gather firewood so the men in his company could warm their C rations in the kitchen of an abandoned home where they were billeted. When he returned, his colonel informed the men that he needed a special volunteer patrol to deliver ammunition and food to an advanced unit. Because Swainson had not taken off his uniform or his boots, he volunteered for the duty. I heard this story actually from Swainson's daughter when I gave a tour to her years ago. He and 4 other soldiers loaded up a Jeep, and Swainson and another soldier were on point ahead of the heavily loaded Jeep. As they proceeded down the road, with 2 other soldiers walking alongside the Jeep. Encountering a downed tree across the road, Swainson walked back to the Jeep to get the help of his comrades in moving the obstacle. As he was walking back to his point position, the Jeep hit a German Teller mine loaded with 11 pounds of TNT, and the explosion killed 3 of the 5 men in the patrol and took off one of Swainson's legs, and so badly damaged the other that it would also have to be amputated. Both amputations were below the knee. His daughter also shared a part of this story. They said that when Swainson came to in the hospital, the commanding officers came to him and asked who was with them in the patrol because they needed to ID the bodies. There was so little left of them. They weren't sure who was out on the patrol with him that night. He was first evacuated to Verdun, then to Paris, then to England, then to Staten Island, and eventually home to Michigan, to Percy Jones Veterans Hospital in Battle Creek. The explosion not only resulted in the loss of his legs, but also broke his jaw, lacerated his tongue, it broke a rib, badly damaged both hands with shrapnel. Swainson would undergo numerous operations on the stumps of his legs, in another operation to remove a piece of chain link that had penetrated his upper leg and was causing severe pain and hemorrhages. He also would undergo intense rehabilitation to learn how to use his prosthetics. In a letter to his father, shortly after his wounding, Swainson wrote, quote, "There are guys here worse off than me." In another letter to his mother, he said, "I don't want any of you worrying about me because I'm fine." This was the attitude about his loss that he exuded throughout his life, refusing to refer to it as a handicap, but preferring the term disability, and serving also as a role model for other recent amputees. His daughter shared a story with me also that one of the things Swainson, I shouldn't say liked to do, but felt compelled to do, was when he would hear about recent amputees locally, he would go to the hospitals to visit them. And she told me a story that he had gone to visit a young man who just recently lost both of his legs. And Governor Swainson started to talk to him about how he shouldn't see it as a death sentence and that it's a disability, but it's something that could be overcome and he could still go on to achieve great things in his life. And the young man looked at him very bitterly and said, "What would you know about this?" And Swainson's daughter told me that he proceeded to unbuckle his belt and dropped his trousers in front of the young man to show that he too was a double amputee. And that story stuck with me. I probably heard it 25 years ago. It was a pretty incredible story. Taking advantage of the GI Bill, he enrolled at Olivet College in 1946, and there met soon after married fellow student Alice Nielsen. We are going a little over, sorry. They would have three children. They moved to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, following a doctor's advice that the warmer climate would make his recovery easier. Swainson enrolled at the University of North Carolina as an undergraduate while simultaneously attending law school. After receiving his law degree in 1951, they moved back to Michigan and he practiced law in Detroit. Elected to the Michigan Senate in 1954, 2 years later, he was chosen minority leader, and in 1958 was elected as lieutenant governor, serving alongside fellow veteran and Governor G. Mennen Williams. From this post, he successfully ran for governor in 1960 on the same ticket that elected fellow veteran John F. Kennedy to the presidency. In 1962, he would lose his re-election bid to George Romney, and in 1970 was elected to serve on the Michigan Supreme Court. 1975, he was convicted by a federal jury of committing perjury in reference to bribery charges that had been brought against him. The conviction led to his resignation from the Supreme Court and the suspension of his law license. Upon his rehabilitation, both personally and professionally, he was able to regain his law license and served as the president of the Michigan Historical Commission from 1985 to his death in 1994. The commission still bestows an annual award, the John B. Swainson Award, in his honor. He's buried at Oak Grove Cemetery in Manchester, Michigan. William Brown Milliken, 44th governor, 1969 to 1982, World War II, 15th Air Force, 321st Squadron, 42nd Wing, 450th Bombardment Group, February 26, 1943 to September of 1945. William Braun Milliken was born March 26, 1922 in Traverse City. He entered Yale University but interrupted his studies to enlist in the Army Reserve Corps in September of 1942. He had applied for officer candidate school, but the U.S. Army Air Force needed B-24 waist gunners more than they needed officers. So on February 26, 1943, he enlisted at Fort Devens, Massachusetts at the age of 22. He trained at Lowry Field in Colorado, where he met his future wife, Helen, whom he married in 1945. They would have two children. He trained at Harlinger Field in Texas, and after receiving his training in his aerial gunner's wings, Milliken's 10-man crew was assembled in Topeka, Kansas, where they picked up their brand new B-24 Liberator bomber, which they flew to Bangor, Maine, Gander, Newfoundland, Azores, Tunisia, where the crew was sent to Italy as part of the 15th Air Force, 721st Squadron, 42nd Wing of the 450th Bombardment Group. You know, I could hardly tie my shoes at 22. It boggles the mind to think of these young men picking up a B-24 bomber in Topeka, Kansas, and flying it to Tunisia. Just amazes me. 4 days after their arrival in Italy, his crew is divided up with veteran crews for a bombing mission over the oil fields of Ploesti, Romania. On that first mission, Milliken had his first experience with German anti-aircraft flak, witnessing the plane next to him being hit and only 10-man crew bailing out over occupied territory. On October 7, 1944, on his 25th bombing mission, this time over Vienna, Austria, after dropping their bombs, Milliken's Liberator was hit in the engine by enemy guns. They were forced to fly below the flak. There they were exposed to ground fire, and his plane was hit by a shell, the shrapnel of which pierced his flak suit, and he was wounded in the stomach. He spent 4 days in the hospital and was then returned to his plane. He was the first of his crew to be wounded, but eventually 4 other crew members were wounded at different times during their 50 required combat missions. On takeoff for what was supposed to be what they called a milk run, an easy mission, their plane experienced engine trouble. It was replaced with another older plane loaded with 2,200 gallons of fuel. And on attempting takeoff, the right landing gear collapsed, spilling its hold of bombs on the runway. Fortunately, for some inexplicable reason, the plane did not explode, and the crew was able to jump out of the waist gunner doors and escape. Milliken said it was the most excitement he'd ever seen, a group of 10 men scrambling to get out a narrow waist gun door before the plane was lit up. On another mission, again over Vienna, they were hit using 2 engines, forcing them to lighten their load, including their 50 caliber waist guns, so they were unprotected. They had to crash land in northern Italy in friendly territory. And yet another mission, after dropping their bombs, their plane was hit again, knocking out their hydraulic landing gear, and the crew was forced to bail out over southern Italy, again thankfully in Allied territory. After flying his 50th mission, he was rotated back to the States, sent to California to fight forest fires until the end of the war, receiving his discharge September 29, 1945. He would receive the Air Medal with 2 bronze oak leaf clusters, the American Campaign Medal, European, African, Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 1 Silver Service Star and 3 Bronze Service Stars, and the World War II Victory Medal, and of course the Purple Heart. Milliken resumed his studies at Yale, returned to Traverse City to the family department store business. 1947, he was appointed to the Michigan Waterways Commission and was elected to the Michigan Senate in 1960, following his father and grandfather's footsteps. His father, James Milliken, was actually serving in the Michigan Senate at the time his son, William, was serving in World War II. William Milliken ran successfully successfully as a moderate Republican candidate for lieutenant governor and was elected to the position in 1964. 1966, Governor George Romney and Milliken ran on the same ticket and were re-elected this time to a 4-year term. Milliken became governor in 1969 upon the resignation of Governor Romney when he accepted a position in the Nixon administration. Milliken would go on to be re-elected to 3 more 4-year terms as governor, making him Michigan's longest-serving governor to date. He died on October 18, 2019 at the age of 97 in Traverse City and is buried on Mackinac Island. Each of the men covered in this presentation had one thing in common. They had the hearts of servants, desiring to serve not only their nation in times of national crisis, but also seeking to serve their state in any capacity they could. Each of them, in their own unique way, helped to make this country and this state what it is today. It is in their honor and to their memory that this talk is dedicated. Thank you so much. Any questions anyone has? I'll attempt to answer them.
It's just a comment.
Please.
You mentioned that Milliken, after 58 missions, was sent to California to fight forest fires. That was a holding pattern in case of air crew flying over
Japan.
and shot
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
They were right there, and they were not highly motivated firefighters.
Yeah.
They thought they had done.
Yeah. It is interesting that the air combat crews were able to rotate out after 50 missions. I've read some books on this, and amazing what those men went through in the service they saw. Other questions or comments? Yeah, please.
So I noticed for quite a few earlier governors that they only served 1 2-year term and didn't run for re-election after. Is that a common theme, or is that one for the better?
So a little bit about that. Romney was the first governor to serve a 4-year term. The 1963 state constitution, which we still work under with some amendments in our state, increased the term from 2 to 4 years. So as far as the not seeking re-election, it wasn't a terribly lucrative position for one thing, and including Governor Blair left the office destitute, basically. It spent most of the money he did have serving the state and traveling to meet with soldiers in the field and attending things on his own dime. So I don't know if that was a huge part of it, but it really wasn't a very lucrative position. And governors typically took a hit financially serving in the position. And some of it was political, for other reasons. They opted not to run. Do you want to add anything to that, Jacob? Do you have any thoughts on that?
There were not term limits at the time, and as far as I know, in the 2-year term era, the only governor to serve 3 terms is Fred Warner
Okay.
in the early 20th century. So even if there were some of them were serving 2 years, I think at most a balanced number were serving 2 terms. They weren't long serving people in those days, like nowhere near
Thank you.
Milliken. So
Thank you. Appreciate that. Please. Yeah. I've looked for them in other states. I think other states have versions of the Brown books, but I don't think any of them are nearly as detailed as Michigan's was. So 1882, the Adjutant General of Michigan, John Robertson, who had served during the Civil War, compiled Michigan in the War, which was a history of the service of the Michigan regiments during the recent unpleasantness, as some people referred to it. He included in the end a short paragraph description of each officer from Michigan, and the enlisted men were pretty upset by that they didn't have their own book with their name listed and a brief description of their service. So it was kind of under that pressure from the veterans that the Brown books were compiled. Later on in the early, I think 1902 was when they came out. So it's quite a few years after the war, and it was largely due to the pressure that Michigan veterans had put on the state government to compile it. And I'm sure glad they did, because they're a really wonderful resource. Not completely accurate. There's some mistakes both in Michigan in the war and in the Brown books, but it was a pretty darn good attempt at compiling that. Other questions? Thanks. Yeah, please.
I think it's interesting, up until World War II, all the governor veterans had been officers.
Yeah,
And then the last two were.
yeah,
enlisted.
that's true. Yeah, that is true.
Also interesting, we haven't had a governor with military background.
Since William Milliken, yeah, that was actually one of our state police officers I was chatting with before the program, and he mentioned the same thing and found it very interesting. You know, especially post-Civil War, you almost had to have a Civil War pedigree to get elected to almost any office in Michigan. And if you hadn't served, you had to have had a pretty darn good reason for not having served in the Civil War. I mean, literally, you could hardly get elected dog catcher in any town in Michigan if you didn't have a Civil War pedigree. So a lot of them kind of, even though they didn't rely on that service, they understood politically it was an important thing to have on their resume. Thanks so much. Appreciate your patience. I'm sorry I kept you a little bit over. Thanks, Jacob.
Slide on this,
Yeah.
you have a sketch of a battle.
Yeah.